Hello and welcome to today's webinar on future-proofing your utility's cybersecurity compliance. I'm John Dirkman, Vice President of Product Management with Resource Innovations, formerly known as Nexent. I'm joined by my colleague and expert, Dave Cullen, the Field CTO at OTORIO. The agenda for today is we'll start by walking you through an overview of Resource Innovations and OTORIO's software and services. We'll move on to give you a background on compliance and regulation, talk about going beyond compliance. Looking further, what does the future look like going forward? Then we'll open it up to Q&A. And we'll ask you some polling questions as we go to kind of encourage your participation in this webinar. Also, as we go, you can submit and upvote questions for the Q&A session at the end. So there's a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. This will open up a new window. You can view all the questions that have been submitted and then type in your own. Once the questions have been entered, you can then upvote them. Click the thumbs up icon, that'll rise it up to the top, and we'll answer those in the order of priority. And you can upvote as many questions as you like, of course, and ask as many questions as you like, and we encourage you to do that. We'll also give you our emails at the end of the recording and encourage you to email us if you have questions after. And we'll also be recording this webinar so that you can send it on to others in the organization or review it at your convenience. All right, so polling question number 1, within your utilities network, do you expect the percentage of distributed energy resources to over time to increase? And by this, the distributed resources are solar, wind, energy storage, batteries, some demand response programs. How do you see those progressing going forward? Okay, now for background on Resource Innovations and OTORIO's utility software and services. So for Resource Innovations, for many, many years, we provided customer strategy and customer incentive type work. We do portfolio and program planning, some behavioral science and research, demand response strategy. So utility will come to us and say, hey, we want to implement these types of programs. And we will do some advising of them for that and integration and kicking off for those programs. For customer incentives, similarly, we look at program design, program marketing, customer engagement, implementation, delivery, and we actually manage a call center to help you manage some of these billing type questions that come through. At the bottom is what I'll be focusing on today, energy software platforms. We'll talk about Grid 360 for transmission, distribution, analysis, and optimization. We'll talk about a little bit about iHedge, which is the financial transmission rights and analytics, more on that in a future webinar. And just a kind of an interesting note that every year, over $1 billion of energy are analyzed with our iHedge platform, and iEnergy for workflow modeling and customer engagement. Some of the work we're doing there, we'll cover that in a future webinar. We also have a team that does grid modernization work, generation, transmission, and distribution, operations and expansion planning, grid reliability and compliance, and grid modernization analysis, strategy, and support. And we work with utilities all around the world to help them look forward and how to modernize their grid. And now I'll turn it over to Dave Cullen to talk about the grid security piece powered by OTORIO.
Thanks, John. So as we talk about grid security powered by OTORIO, we really look at OT security as breaking down into a variety of functions, but our focus is really to provide contextualized assessments that bring in compliance into focus. So we'll cover that today. We have asset visibility. We call it 2.0. What we look at is extended asset visibility. What else can we see about the devices that are on the grid in your OT environment? Along with that is risk management and proactive exposure discovery. Really looking at what are your attack vectors and risks, where are you exposed, where should your priorities be, and then of course we have an audit and compliance module which should resonate with utilities, SOC and response integration, We really do look to provide contextualized information for security response. And along with that, we have a suite of services where we can come in, whether it's penetration testing or incident response. We have an expert team in our professional services department that are experienced in OT security. So really, when we look at assessments, OTORIO has three vectors. One is a risk assessment toolbox. We call that SPOT. And really the focus there is on-demand, portable assessments that might support a few different use cases. One might be a factory acceptance test. So, in the supply chain, have what we call a machinery builder or manufacturer test their equipment with our tools and be able to provide a certificate of compliance to whoever they're selling that machine to. We also use SPOT for point-in-time assessments, and it can be aligned with various different control frameworks, whether it be NERC-CIP or NIST-CSF, IEC 62443. SPOT really takes what can be an arduous process doing an assessment and adds a lot more depth that traditionally, is performed by a person. So we can speed up the time to the report being delivered, and again, give a lot more context and depth to that report. So it looks at the compliance framework, but looks at the context of the environment and perhaps beyond the extents of the environment. Then our flagship product is RAM Squared, which is a risk assessment platform. Really takes all of what we have in SPOT and the point-in-time mentality and makes it into continuous compliance and risk monitoring solution. Really, it does deeper integration with the other solutions in your security systems, whether that be in OT or IT, and does build a continuous context so it can detect threats and give you a good idea of what both your risk and security posture are at any given time. And then, of course, we have services-driven assessment. We have our Recon OT, which does global attack surface mapping and general risk assessments and supply chain security assessments and security architecture reviews. So let's look at our flagship RAM Squared product, which is really focused on being digital risk-based management workflow solution. First, we ingest asset and network management information. We seek to build up that enhanced asset database. What devices are on your network? And we don't only do that by looking at the OT network from our platform itself. We look to ingest information from other devices, whether it be a firewall or your endpoint protection or your network devices, really to build great context and enrich that asset inventory. We pair that with research from our expert research team, and we build up an intelligence database and a vulnerability database that we can analyze these devices and compare. What are known vulnerabilities? What are potential exploits? And really seek to define the risk posture at a device level. And from there, we really can build contextualized insights, compliance reports, playbooks, really give the information to both your users and operators, but also into other platforms such as Grid 360. And at the end, we end up really in a place where we have risks and exposures. So really to take that kind of mature risk-based approach and create a threat model from that. And we can do breach and attack simulation through our digital twin technology. So again, we look at proactive exposure discovery. While post-breach is certainly something that the platform can provide, the marketplace often used to indicators of compromise. What happened and what went wrong? What was compromised? We prefer to look pre-breach. We look at indicators of exposure. We believe that really there's great ROI for cyber and digital risk management. In other words, being able to look at the environment and make recommendations and improvements before a breach happens. In an industrial environment, detection is still important, but if the breach has reached that point, you're already behind the 8 ball. And we looked again, this can create, traditionally create a lot of noise. So we looked to build mitigation playbooks for ease of response. And really just an example of how we take that operational noise and we kind of look to getting actionable insights. So this is an example from 2 weeks analysis where we had 4.5 million events and we took it down to 358 indicators, which generated 267 alerts. But here's the key. Using our playbook approach and building contextualized insights, we were able to provide 26 insights that gave clear action and really enabled ease of response. But it's also important to note that at the same time, while we're doing all of this, we're gathering details for audit and compliance. So we have multiple level visibility where you can look at the compliance level of an asset, a site, a regional, organizational, that whole different hierarchy. You can look at the different risk context and really be able to get a good picture of your progress and where you're at. And so a little bit about how we do it. The RAM Squared platform is really built on the concept of a central management server, but we have edges. And these are the devices that sit within the OT network and really collect information, whether that's through like a passive network monitor or integration with one of your existing systems. Maybe there's a connection to your DCS or SCADA system. And so those edges really collect the information and bring it back up into central management where data is analyzed and creates those insights. And we really do all at the central management layer. We'll do that risk evaluation, compliance and policy insights, and really build up the context that your operators, your compliance personnel, whoever you need to kind of give that information, that visibility into, can access the information that's relevant to them. And of course, we create integrations with other systems. We don't believe in creating an island, so to speak. So we look, if you need ticketing, we integrate with your ticketing system or your existing IT SIM or what have you. We believe that integrations are of huge value.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. It's really impressive what all your platform provides. Let's switch over, segue into Grid 360 Distribution Analytics Platform. I'll give you some background on it as well. So for many years, we write the engines that power GE, ABB, Toshiba, and Smarter Grid Solutions, ADMS, DERMS, and EMS solutions. So some of the tools are for state estimation, power flow, contingency analysis, and fault analysis to determine the current operating state of your distribution grid, using that measurement information to better actually improve the quality of that data. We can also look at severity and worst system loading and voltage contingency violations based on modeling of outages for contingency analysis, generating alerts, and calculating fault levels. So that's kind of our foundational engines. We also have the ability to analyze everything the modern grid can experience, everything from demand response, distributed generation, including solar with smart inverters, distributed energy resources, mainly battery energy storage, electric vehicles, microgrids, and with integration with iEnergy, a way to even improve your customer engagement of between the utility and the customer. We offer some nice tools for load profiling, taking meter data and generating load profiles. Also short-term, meaning hours ahead or days ahead, and long-term load and DER forecasting to better predict what's going to occur on your grid. We can, of course, from that, we can generate alerts. We can dispatch resources based on those forecast conditions. We also have some nice tools for managing independent grids, which are interconnected, smaller grids, really behind the meter type assets, and microgrids. Looking at also at reliability coordination and market operations across multiple interconnected grids. So doing some very interesting work in Europe on this as well to look at how multiple grids interact. And last but not least, and really the topic of this webinar is at the bottom, is advanced security, data quality, and reliability analytics. So through our partnership with OTORIO, we track the critical and vulnerable assets within the network. We send that to OTORIO. They process it using their platform and return results to us for visualization and further analysis. So we can look at the assets, we can look at the communication channels, look at protocols and encryption, patches and mitigations, ownership, and access and safety, and drill down into that to really give you a good idea of the major risk points within your network. Also, we have some nice tools to analyze and improve transformative meter assignment, phase assignment, sizing of device and conductors, and asset health forecasting, as well as energy theft. So kind of looking at how the underlying data is organized, structured, and improving that, and looking at better ways to improve asset health and energy theft and outage cause and restoration going forward. So really just a nice background. We've done this, of course, again, for many, many years in our analysis with our engines. And then so there's some screenshots there of the Grid 360 user interface as well. So here, an enlarged view of it. So it's an example where we've got some utility data. We've sent it to OTORIO, and we have APIs in place between our two platforms, and received results back from them showing a device, a calculated risk score, the firmware version that's installed, and the Ethernet interface information, and the number of cyber alerts that are generated. So it's just one of many use cases to go and, again, determine that the cyber risk and health, if you will, of your network. Now, I'll turn it back to you, Dave, for this piece.
Thanks, John. So let's take a step and let's really dig into compliance and regulation, which is the focus of this webinar. And we'll start to see the picture of how our approach kind of applies to the subject matter, whether it's NERC-CIP or what have you. So digging into NERC-CIP a little, we have really 10 themes that it covers off. Now, these are tied to different controls. For example, identification categorization is CIP-002-5.1A. I'm going to focus less on this specific control, but really dig into these themes. So with identification and categorization, really this speaks to the fundamentals of knowing what you have and having the appropriate asset inventory, but having it categorized appropriately. So you must know what assets you have, what processes you have that apply to the bulk electric system. And then within that, it's really to be able to categorize your assets as low, medium, high. Now, certainly medium and high assets end up having more scrutiny applied to them. So it's really important to know that and know the data flows so you know the relationships and how everything's working together. Now, security controls, really the primary purpose here is to establish clear accountability for the protection of the bulk electric cyber systems, or what we'll call BES systems. Through delegation of authority and identification of senior manager, there needs to be people responsible for putting these controls in place, and the controls need to be audited. Now, background checks and training. Important to know the staff, contractors, the people operating these assets or the grid around them need to have the appropriate screening. And then there needs to be the appropriate training as well. Now, what could that training look like? I think it is really cybersecurity awareness. And what comes into that, like your policies, your physical access controls, electronic access controls, et cetera, et cetera. Really, there needs to be that in-depth training for cybersecurity awareness. I think it goes a bit beyond that too. We need to look at risk and access control management, right? So there needs to be, personal risk assessment and an asset or an access management program. Who gets access to what? And then as important as granting access, how do you revoke access? And how are all those procedures documented? And a consistent theme throughout NERC-CIP controls is that these are regularly reviewed. And usually there's a specified cadence. And it's important to note, when your last review period was, who did it, the senior manager sign off. All of those things are really important to keep track of. Then we look at like electronic security, and this generally relates with CIP 5. It really speaks to the electronic security perimeter and being able to control remote access and really know kind of those perimeters and how the devices are communicating in and out. But just as important as physical security, we know that we're talking about transmission stations, generation. We're in very critical infrastructure. So we should see a physical security plan, a visitor control program, a maintenance and testing program. And really, these are both qualitative and quantitative measures when you go to assess them, but it's important that these are in place. And then system security, CIP 7. And really, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. It's very prescriptive in how you secure these systems, whether it's, in the context of ports and services, security patch management, malicious code prevention, security event monitoring, system access controls. It really does speak to, especially on the medium and high assets, how you secure the systems and audit that security program. Incident management. This is very, another important one, as all these controls are. But oftentimes, I find that we can always stand to do a bit more practice on our incident management. And so, really, it's to have an incident response plan in place for cybersecurity. And that's going to talk about who, what, when, where, why. Pretty standard questions, but beyond that, you must be testing it. So once the plan's implemented, there should be a test at least once every 15 months to ensure that people are up to speed and have a good awareness of how to respond to an incident. And then, of course, post-incident, it's important to do a review. So within 90 days of a live incident or planned exercise, typically you should have a response plan review, update, and communicate to those involved. Recovery plans. So again, as an extension of an incident response, what would the plans be to recover? In your business continuity plan, how does that all fit in? Specifying, how recovery happens. Again, testing it, same interval, 15-month period. And then again, the same review process that after a planned response exercise, any changes to the response plan must be shared. So again, looking at lessons learned and continuously reviewing. And then configuration and vulnerabilities. Important to, while we can't always patch in these environments, we must be able to prove, first of all, that we have detected vulnerabilities, patched where we can. And if we can't, we must have, a mitigating control or documentation as to why that can't be patched. So we're looking again, at least once every 35 days that the baseline is checked for unauthorized changes, that we're doing vulnerability assessments. And the more frequent this can be, the better. And then finally, information protection, which really is to, protect the information that's found within this program, but then also it's your asset reuse and disposal procedures. How are you decommissioning? How are you ensuring that there's no confidential information being leaked out? So all those are kind of important fundamentals. Now let's take that though and apply it, because many organizations are facing, there's multiple compliance frameworks, perhaps. What we've seen is, while NERC-CIP has really worked well to build up the foundation and the awareness in the utility space, it covers BES assets. So you have, no doubt, other assets. You have other IT environments or what have you that really need to be focused on, because those can be kind of part of the attack model. We're running more converged environments today. And you have all the protections in place, but we see the trend of a lot of threats coming in from the general IT network and then moving over to an OT network. So we like to focus on the concept of maturity model, where you might be taking multiple frameworks together, but in a single pane of glass, really look to continuously move maturity up the ladder. And what does that look like? Well, initially, a lot of it is tied directly to having the basics in place. So NERC-CIP certainly forces that, and you're audited on it. But you really want to also, outside of NERC-CIP, really make sure you have the basics in place: asset inventory, vulnerability management, having these pieces that really set the stage for success. But as we talk maturity models, really what we want to do is improve that maturity. And that's where we get into really looking at repeatable processes and measurable processes. So, back to what we saw with NERC-CIP and as well what you should have on the IT side, that focusing on business continuity, on incident response, recovery capability, all those things really do speak to increase in maturity, but they need to be paired. All of this needs to be paired with a repeatable process and a measurable process. So as you increase in maturity, you need to be able to, say that this is our review cycle. We've done these tabletop exercises. We've brought up new staff and trained them in this way. And really, once you start to take that holistic view of people, process, and technology, you'll start to find that, compliance, dare I say it, becomes easier because you've really matured those processes, that you're confident in them, but you have all of the policy, all of the procedure, and all the supporting documentation really to prove that you're at that place. So how does all this work together? Well, we believe it really does start with audit and assessment, and those in compliance and regulation are definitely used to this. The regular audit and assessment life cycle really does, it drives a lot of work, but it actually drives a lot of value. But we believe on top of that, there's qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis. And really that comes from not only looking at our frameworks and our controls, but starting to look at our risks. And those are often driven from the business context. And so that can create kind of that circle where there's the overlap in that analysis, is really looking at how frameworks and controls and risk work together. And once you get to the point of having those all in view, what you're able to do is really develop that accurate threat model to know what could impact your business. What do you need to be focusing on? What risks need priority to mitigate? You can really look at your threat model and make good business decisions that are not just purely based on, I need to be compliant with this framework and check this box by this time, but really that we've built an effective security program that is compliant, but also really has ingrained a lot of people and process into the equation, such that we're risk informed and we're making good decisions to secure the environment. And I think we recently surveyed 200 CISOs from across the globe to look at what their drivers for OT security were. And certainly compliance was still number one at 86%. But I want to kind of draw your attention to how high, because we allowed people to answer more than one answer on this question, but look at how high digitization and growth enablement ranks, and then look at where cyber attacks are in people's minds. So you can see that they're both above 80%, not that far behind compliance. So what you see is this that we have multiple drivers that we're considering. We know what's going on in the world around us. We know that risk and threat is elevated. But yeah, compliance as well, it's built a great foundation. Obviously, we're seeing the greater awareness of how this all works together. So we believe that while compliance is a great business driver, it also builds that foundation to really be able to confidently address these other drivers because they are front and center on the CISO's mind, on the C-level executive's mind. And it's just going to continue to ramp up. So we have another polling question for you. So how confident are you in your utilities methods for cybersecurity? Say it's NERC-CIP and or NIST compliance. So ranging from not at all confident to very confident to you just don't know. So let's look to the future for a little bit. I believe that we're really just seeing the tip of the iceberg of growth on the grid. We saw the driver in the previous slide there about digital growth being front and center of people's minds, and I think it's true. It's accurate. What we're seeing, there's many new technologies being deployed on the grid: distributed energy resource, microgrids, microgeneration. All of these new technologies, really, as they're added to our legacy grids, expand the attack surface. But not just that. When you look from a compliance perspective, we now have the potential for many more assets. There might only be low impact BES assets, but they would be a BES asset nonetheless. So that increases the scope of your compliance program. You must be able to address the rapid change. It's going to put pressure on your internal teams, really, to keep track and be able to assess as new technology comes online, what applies to it, how should we protect it, what controls do we need to implement. All of those things are going to work into the equation and really drive more work and scope in our compliance programs.
Yeah, and like Dave said, it's really looking at the utility model and determining what threats are presented. So here's an example of a utility modeled with a large number of distributed energy resources. The small kind of the pink on signs represent Internet of Things, devices that are interconnected for a demand response program. The solar, you can see, you've got some EV charging, you've got some energy storage as well. And it's just exposing or increasing the potential for threats, right? To interruption of communication systems, to altering subtly the results of some of these measurements, to influence behavior on that network, and to really possibly interrupt operations or severely disrupt them. We've got some load curves shown there, which are for forecasting purposes. Those also can be potentially altered by an attacker to again determine or result in incorrect readings and incorrect forecasts for management of the distributed energy resources, or worst case, just downtime of that grid, or worse, actually damage to some of the assets on that grid. So these are real threats. We're seeing them, we're reading about them in the news, and it's very important, of course, to implement platforms to understand the threats, analyze the threats, predict the threats, and then, of course, prevent the threats. So, yeah, very good to go through this into some more detail and look at really where the grid is going and how the threat surface is being enlarged. So to wrap it up, again, please ask questions through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Upvote the questions that have been answered or asked, and then Dave and I will answer them. And I will say thank you very much for attending this presentation. And our email addresses are at the bottom, where the general email addresses for Grid 360 and OTORIO. And now we'll open it up for answering some of your questions. Thank you. Very good, thank you. Dave, do you want to address some of the poll results first?
Sure. No real surprise there that the percentage of distributed energy resources over time is expected to increase. I think we're seeing, again, really a tip of the iceberg as to the grid of yesterday kind of transforming it to the grid of tomorrow, and there's so many factors, and we don't need to really focus on them, but there's a lot of momentum that drives it. I think it's exciting to see, but it comes with challenges for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's many marketing studies and studies by utilities vendors that show over time an increase and a projected increase going forward. So yeah, and it's good. It's the purpose of decarbonization to some degree, and that's what we need. All right. And let's see, what about the other second poll question? That was interesting too. Yeah, do you want to comment on this one, Dave?
Yeah, you know what, the numbers kind of line up. We've asked this question before on other webinars, and again, it's interesting how the regulatory environment drives things, how government responds, and we had the realization that a lot of control frameworks or security frameworks tend to be reactive. They're put in place after something happens or after there's some environment changes, what have you. So sometimes it can feel like we're behind the 8-ball, but I think that's the nature of controls. And if you only look at controls and compliance, you'll always kind of feel like we're a bit behind. But that's where if we get into the concepts of risk-based approach, focusing on increasing maturity, and kind of blending that in on top of compliance, you can really, I think, drive confidence out of that, where you set your measurement ahead of time, and then you start tracking your program along with that.
Okay. And then the I don't know answer makes sense. I think a lot of utilities do not publish this information, correct?
Correct. I mean, there's always a risk. You don't want the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, to be out in public record. And some of this, I mean, that's just a reality. Some of this can become public record, and so it's a balance for sure. But you also kind of have to focus on blending this into the culture, right? Of informing people. Compliance can help with awareness training, right? And really get creative.
Yeah, there you go. Good. All right, we can go to some of the questions that were asked. Okay. See if we can bring those up. Yeah, we can do it. Let's see. So first one was how large a threat do IoT devices pose? What's your take on that one, Dave?
The real threat is the unknown. I find that with IoT devices, they perhaps drive a lot of business value, right? They might be creating insight into a process or what have you, but oftentimes they have an undocumented connectivity model. You don't know where they need to communicate. So many are tied to the cloud. It's really it sets things up. You have to be careful that you don't get into a field it fast, fix it later type of mentality, where you add these devices and you don't know exactly how they behave and don't know what to expect, right? So I think that unknown and really the territory of getting into lack of documentation or clear picture of what these devices do can create risk for sure.
Yeah. It seems like it'd be less risky individually than a large generator or a large energy storage device, those kind of things, but maybe an aggregate could certainly influence the behavior of the grid. Yeah.
Right, for sure.
Interesting. All right. Second one was, how should an organization define its target maturity level?
I actually love this question. So, sometimes that might depend on the sector. Some sectors do lay that out, right? So, C2M2, for example, is a popular maturity level measurement, for utilities. So it can really come from that angle, but I like to, always recommend that you start with the organization's mission, vision, and values. And that might not be logical for some, or it might be new territory for some people, but look at how the organization's built. And then really the key here is for the business to help define what's important. Usually it's tied to risk management process and how things are done and how things are measured. And so tie it into the existing business processes as much as possible, rather than creating this island, if you will, that of cybersecurity, especially cybersecurity information that might not just, the subject matter might be complex and might not be digestible by a C-level executive or whatever. So really try and tie it into the business, have executive backing, have board of director backing, and buy in there.
Yeah. Define your goals. Exactly. Good. Makes good sense. All right. Let's see. There's a question. What do you think will drive adoption of distributed energy resources? And I can take a shot at the answer now. When it's a kind of combination of regulatory. Some countries are very pro decarbonization and encouraging of especially solar, and then some energy storage to help balance the variability of solar, wind as well. And it's also to some degree customer demand, right? So people who perceive this as a problem, want to change their behavior, put solar on their roof, or maybe drive an electric vehicle, that will absolutely affect this going forward. I'd say those are probably the two biggest drivers. And then one more question says, do the utilities conduct one-time risk assessment for cyber threats, or should they be looking for a continuous risk posture? As one-time risk assessment is point in time, how does your platform assist utilities?
I can start, because I think we should probably highlight what our platform does and our approach, but also kind of how our integration works and some of the value that Grid 360 drives for sure, right? And so I think the goal for utilities, based on being critical infrastructure, being regulated entities, really is to get to that continuous model, right? To be able to look at risk and really set up your parameters for, what is your target risk level? What do you want to mitigate? What do you want to accept? So really that continuous model should be a goal, but that is generally tied to a higher level of maturity if we get back to that conversation. So a great place to start is those one-time assessments and those point-in-time assessments, and picking up a regular cadence of doing those. So certainly our platform, the core, lends itself through Spot. It really can do those point-in-time assessments. It reduces the friction and the effort to get to a point of, doing an assessment of the environment and aligning it with a specific control framework. So really what we can do is kind of, give a contextualized report of the environment based on the regulatory requirement, the compliance requirement that might be in place, because those do vary based on geography. So, but really moving that to a continuous compliance model where you can bring in the questionnaire approach and engage your staff into, analyzing risk on different sites, the different assets and whatnot, I think is important. But a lot of this is predicated on having an awareness of what you have. Certainly we can do detection and we can do scanning, but then if we talk to Grid 360, I think John can probably chime in, having an awareness of your attack surface and all the devices that you have, is critical. That's really the foundation you need to build this upon. So
Yep, and I'll add, many years ago, I did a webinar about basically enhancing your utility data. And there are 3 C's, data that is complete, data that is correct, and data that is current. And it's expensive, it's time consuming to keep all of those up to date, and also to then look at what data do you really need. And so yeah, Grid 360 is an excellent tool for consolidating, managing, visualizing, and then editing that data going forward. Yeah, it's a big challenge, but it's super important to understand how your network is organized, so you can then examine how it could be threatened. Okay, let's see. Oh, another question came in, Dave. Do you provide continuous monitoring services for OT and IoT, or do any other service providers offer that type of service?
I mean, we could say that this is a yes or no question, and the answer is yes. But yeah, I mean, there are other service providers as well. But again, if you look at what our focus is and what we believe our unique value proposition brings, especially with our integration, is being able to take greater context of the environment, looking, being able, simply being able to ingest assets that Grid 360 is aware of, that without having to scan out to the far reaches of, say, a distributed energy resource that is kind of outside your network, even being able to bring all of that in and create that model, and be able to look for vulnerabilities, look for threats, but then build a risk-informed solution on top of that, I think provides a lot of value, because we believe that it's very easy for to set up monitoring solutions, and you create alert fatigue. You create all of this information that is difficult to operationalize, because the in-depth knowledge of these devices may or may not exist within your team or what have you. So we really seek to drill that down and build up actionable insights from all of this information we're receiving. And that really is what we believe creates a lot of value, because you have something that is very easy to action and improve.
Very good. Very good. All right, that's all the questions we have. I guess, Dave, do you have any closing remarks?
I just thank you for attending, and this is a subject matter that always evolves, and it never really stops, and that can be a lot. It drives a lot of work for organizations. We realize that. So our whole goal and what we're here for is really to try and simplify that and ease the burden, and help organizations move and improve their cybersecurity maturity.
Very good, very good. And I'll say reminders, our email addresses are at the bottom. Those are generalized email addresses for Grid 360 at resource-innovations.com and info@otorio.com. If you think of other questions or you'd like more information, we're happy to answer those for you. And I'll say, yeah, thank you very much for attending. Great questions, interesting results from the poll. And yeah, this is about basically securing the grid. Extremely important. There's a lot of threats out there, a lot of maleficent actors out there. And the more we can do to make the grid stronger, the better. So that will sign off. Say thank you very much, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Cheers.